reserved. We did all, since she's we don't put a lot of like necessary stock in them. The Chinese horoscopes around the year of birth. Tina and I are both dragons, and our daughter is a dog, year-wise, and apparently dog children and dragon parents are like the worst all-time combo ever. Just like totally.
Congratulations! Congratulations!
Yeah.
All I know is when my older son, who's now 31, was 4 years old, I remember crying in the park saying, how am I going to live until he makes it to be 18 and moves out? At age less than 2, he was jumping off of 12-foot walls. I have
questions about tomatoes and citrus trees. Those are the two things that come up the most often. So once people learn you are a master gardener, they will pummel you on tomatoes. So as you hopefully know from reading, I'm basically, this class follows the handbook more or less. So if you've read the chapter, you've basically heard this. You're in the Solanaceae plant family, which is nightshade. So tomatoes, bell and chili peppers, potatoes, eggplant, tomatillo, and that tobacco crop you've always wanted to grow. The reason this is important is we'll come back to it later when it comes to crop rotation, because it's very important, particularly because of how many soil-based viruses affect the nightshade family, that you're doing your crop rotation correctly between seasons. By way of background, recently they've found tomatillo fossils that are 52 million years old in Patagonia. And so they believe that, and when you look at the picture, the current dried tomatillo looks amazingly like what was found in these fossils. So this gives an idea of how old this plant family is and its origins. It's in South America. What happened was it was native to Western South America and Central America, and then around 500 BC, it looks like it began to be cultivated in southern Mexico. In 1521, Cortez conquered southern Mexico and transferred these small yellow tomato plants back to Europe. It appears in a publication as early as 1544, and it's in the cookbook for the Medicis by 1548. So the plant and the variety swept Europe very, very quickly. So the first thing to kind of keep in mind when you're tomato gardening is the world has these binaries. You go one way or the other. They're heirloom tomatoes, open pollinated. You can save the seeds from year to year, and they tend to be valued for taste, color, and shape. They're hybrids, which are crossbred between 2 or more plants. You can't do seed saving, but it does allow you to address specific needs like virus protection or for agricultural purposes. So when you're planning tomato gardens, the first thing you're starting with is do I want to grow heirlooms or hybrids? The second thing you have to deal with is, pardon me, determinate and indeterminate. Now, the difference is pretty fundamental. On the determinate side, these are plants designed for big agriculture. So it's a bush-sized tomato plant that's going to push most of its fruit in one harvest window. And it's basically so you can either run a combine or people through a field and pick a lot of tomatoes at one time. On the indeterminate side, once it starts blooming, it will produce fruit through winter to winter. So it's a short period versus long, and it's a smaller plant versus taller and much more prolific production. So that's your second question. And I'll come up later where these trade-offs step in. The third thing to pay attention to carefully, I don't know how many of you grew up on farms, but if you did, you would know The longer it takes for a crop to grow to maturity and be harvested, the greater the risk. So days to maturity is from when a plant is planted in the ground, or in the case of from a seed, you add 4 to 6 more weeks. How long before, in the perfect conditions, you could expect fruit? And the longer that is, and you will see in tomatoes 55 to as much as 90 days to maturity, the more issues you could have in producing a crop, particularly if we have a cold summer. Another thing to bear in mind is size of fruit. And this range of things, it's interesting to me how many people come to me and want to grow beefsteak tomatoes in cold climates. Or they want to grow small fruit but have it not get too large. So there are trade-offs within these types of tomato side plants. And again, it's sort of, you're kind of designing your tomato garden before you start. So in truth, the USDA says there's 25,000 varieties of tomatoes in America. Other sources say about 10,000. But when you're thinking about it, you have to say, okay, which types of tomatoes do well in Marin County? There's a list. Then you have to say, if you live in a coastal cool part of the county, not all the varieties that do well in Marin do well in coastal cool environments. Inland warm tend to grow everything. Coastal cool is a delimiter of what will grow well. And then another one is, are you planting it in a container or not? And then whether or not you want heirloom versus hybrid, determinate versus indeterminate, and size of fruit. So think of this as an inverted pyramid. You go from 10,000 or 25,000 varieties nationally to a subset for Marin, to a subset if you want to be in a coastal cool climate, or a container, or heirloom, or indeterminate, or by size of fruit. This is sort of how I think about tomato gardening. Sorry then. So when we right plant, right place, what it really is place drives what plant to plant. So particularly when you're doing a help desk job or you're talking to someone at a market, I'm going to sit down for a few minutes. To qualify to understand what's going on with someone, first ask, where do you live and what's your climate? Is it hot or cool? And then where are you planting? In ground, raised beds, or containers? And then what size fruit are you looking for? What are you trying to do, heirloom or hybrid? And frankly, this will drive how you help people. If they say, I'm in a hot climate, in raised beds or in ground, you can grow anything you want. But if they say, I'm in a cool climate or in containers, your choices get narrower. Does this make sense? I'm used to having feedback, so I feel like a late night television host with no crowd. So someone's nodding, good, all right. You'll be my official nodder. It's the person below K on my screen. So we didn't have the tomato market this year, which is a big shame because it's a terrifying hour and a half to 2 hours of retail experience as a master gardener. But if you look at 2019's variety of tomatoes that we had, first off, you can see tomatoes come in all colors, but you can also see some key information that jumps out at you when you look at this. And it's to summarize, some of the plants are, I apologize, I cannot see the top of the first column. You'll see coastal cool, heirloom. I don't see what the fifth is, and then you see type of fruit. Well, this is the list of all of the plants. But if you go into which are cool weather, if you start with the cool weather consideration, you get a subset. And then if you add to that container and coastal cool, out of, I think, 21 varieties that we had, 7 fit that criteria. So if you're in Mill Valley, or if you're in West Marin, or if you're along the coast in Corte Madera and Larkspur, you're in a coastal cool area. And if you're in a container, these would have been the tomatoes we recommended to you out of the 21. And this saves you a lot of time, because people who are trying to grow really big fruit or really hot weather tomatoes in cool climates, they just don't do well. So are there any questions? Let me just stop here, because this is sort of the first chunk of important thing. How do I see questions? Okay.
I can ask you, I can see them on my screen, Joe. So okay. Let me get to the top of the question list. So from Isabel to everyone, these are different varieties. Isabel, I guess.
So what I was asking was about the two different types, like the one that you grow for like mass production versus the other ones. Like,
yes, determinate versus indeterminate.
That is that like something that you'll see on like a seed packet that you're buying? Yeah. Will it say that?
Or frankly, I'll look up before I go to buy tomatoes, I research online, and you'll find it, you know, at the better seed companies, they'll list those things for you.
Okay, and then just like in general, are like the more common ones like just the regular growth ones, or are people trying to grow the kind of like mass production ones?
Well, it's a good question. It's kind of like applying to college. You want 1 or 2 safe choices every year. So, for example, people complain that Early Girl doesn't have a lot of flavor, but it's almost brain dead simple to grow. Okay. And it's an early days to maturity. Likewise, the Sun Gold and the Sweet 100s are sure shot cherry tomatoes. So depending upon who you're talking to, sometimes you're talking to someone who's never grown tomatoes at all or hasn't grown them here. And they might want to be trying to be fairly conservative. Other cases, people are more adventuresome or they want to try something new. So you kind of have to be able to go both ways. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And Jeff asks, do the days to maturity have any cultural requirements? For example, daytime and nighttime temps?
I'll get to that later, but yes, they do.
Okay, next question from Glenda. Are determinate tomatoes usually hybrid seeds?
Yes.
From Jeff, I had to start my own seeds, harumph. From Diane to everyone, do you consider where you live in Larkspur to be coastal cool?
I'm a block from Pecos, and the answer is no. But if I go about 6 blocks east of me, the answer is yes. So it depends on where you are, because the low ground along the Corte Madera Creek, cold air flows in. So you can be coastal cool within a couple blocks of here.
Wow. Arlene asks, what does open pollinated mean?
It's a emerging category as a distinction of heirlooms tend to be seeds that have been in the market for over 50 years and consistent, and open pollinated, I think technically are newer than 50 years, but they still have the characteristics of an heirloom.
Jeff asks, why in the heirloom column are some listed as yes and others as open pollinated?
Because the open pollinated, the yes ones are the ones that have been categorized as heirloom for more than 50 years. And for example, brandy wine is from the 1850s. Yeah. And open pollinated are newer heirlooms, in my opinion.
And for the sections, for the coastal cool, are these all ones that will grow in the coastal cool areas?
Yes. Where it
And
says yes, that means they'll also grow in a hot climate. But if you're trying to optimize for one of the cooler parts of Marin, those would be the ones to look at.
and would you like say for the bush cherry, it says like container, like for that to grow best in a cool area, would you grow it in a container?
You don't have to. The ones that will grow well in a container will also grow well in a raised bed or in the ground.
Okay.
Okay. All right. That's the questions for now, Joe.
Okay. By the way, very good questions. So the next way I talk to people about tomatoes, and by the way, I got into this is sort of how master gardeners work. We had a genius tomato whisperer who was still alive when I was in class. And I thought tomatoes were interesting. So I started reading more and whatnot. And then a year later, she had been in her 90s and she died. And I don't know why, but someone asked me to teach a public seminar on tomatoes. And suddenly, here it is, 7 years later, and I teach tomatoes. And so this is, if you find something that interests you, there's a way that you can feed your curiosity for years in master gardeners, but I digress. So the next thing to think about, particularly when you're trying to help someone, is where are you planting these plants? And the three places are in-ground, raised beds, and containers, logically. Well, the reason to ask that is because of this. Tomatoes have unbelievable root systems. And this is a study that was done in Russia where they were growing plants in soil between plates of glass. And so at 4 weeks after you've moved a plant, transplanted it, you can have a root system already that's between 2 feet in each direction and about 2.5 feet deep. But at 10 weeks, it could be 6 to 7 feet wide and 3 to 4 feet deep. And the reason is the plant is looking for moisture and nutrients. So to produce all that fruit, the plant is spreading out in all directions underground first to find nutrients and moisture and water. And so that's why when you say I'm in a container, immediately you need a variety that grows well in a constrained area. And so what you're really doing in tomato gardening and in vegetable gardening in general is you're growing your soil, and the soil grows the vegetables. So in my case, and this is, I'm only speaking for myself, I add compost and manure to my vegetable bins twice a year. In the spring, I did it, I guess, the first week of March. And in the fall, I do it the last week of September. And there's a process you go through. You pick a day that you're going to take out whatever's already growing, or decide that you're leaving your onions to later. And you remove all the plant debris, and then you add compost and you mulch it selectively. And you can basically, depending upon what plant, green mulch is if you know that you're going to have enough leaf coverage that you don't have to add mulch. But this growing the soil, an awful lot of problems occur because of soil decline. And it particularly in container gardening, but also in raised beds. So this is sort of one of the fundamentals. And you can do soil testing and to augment your soil, but frankly, if you're adding compost and twice a year, your soil should be in pretty good shape. And we'll talk more about that in the segment on vegetable gardening. But this combination of, and then in some cases, people want to go further and fertilize, in which case just a 5-5-5 fertilizer is fine. I have not found I need fertilizer if I've kept the compost coming in regularly. So tomatoes need 6 hours or more of sunlight, preferably 8 to 10. And they want, if you're in a cool climate, there's some tricks to playing with that. So you want to be on the south or west side of a house. If you are in West Marin or Mill Valley, planting against walls and fences so that the sun is reflected against the wall at the other side of the plant, and planting in plastic or metal containers retain heat. And plants like to be warm. They like their feet to be dry, so good drainage, and they want to be in the sunlight. And so there's ways to boost production in cooler climates. I planted a church garden in Belvedere 5-6 years ago, and everyone who went to the church said, you can't grow tomatoes here, it's too cool. But a woman from Mill Valley had taught me to use gravel around galvanized metal raised beds, and the gravel keeps the heat and reflects the sunlight, and that's a very productive garden now. So this is sort of a cool site strategy. The other thing is, if you're in constrained areas, is planning for the verticality. So if you're against walls and you've done it correctly, it's also a windbreak. You want to be, the larger the container, the better. So this adds to the idea of making your garden more robust. And then there are companion plants. But before I go on to companion plants, are there any questions about the piece I just went through? Because it's sort of basic tomato garden planning before you've ever put the plant in the ground. Questions? Okay.
Yeah, Joe Emery asks, I also started my own coastal cool seeds this year after Tea Day was canceled. I found it difficult to source the seeds from one supplier. Does Marin Master Gardeners have preferred suppliers for seeds? That's back to the seed question.
Well, you know, this is a rough year. I was part of a panic buying frenzy in March. And it's very hard to find the more specialized seeds out there at all. So good luck. I don't know, because most of the seed companies that I used to buy from were out of product in the middle of March.
Wow. So Jeff asks, how much space should each plant have? I use square foot design in my raised bed and wonder how many squares apart to place the plants.
That's a really good question. So I hadn't put the distancing yet. Theoretically, you should be 3 feet apart from, you know, stalk to stalk or more. And for example, if you're planting cherry tomatoes, indeterminate plants that grow prolifically, they're going to fill up a bigger volume than determinates. So if you have a smaller space, use determinates. If you have a bigger space, you can spread them out. But 3 to 4 feet is sort of the minimum. The year I grew 24 tomatoes plants, which some people thought was a little excessive, I was on 2 feet spans between them, and that was just a jungle. It was too much. But I had an incredible crop, so, you know, I don't know. It was interesting. They were climbing all over each other. It was great. Did that answer your question?
I'm assuming so.
Okay.
Okay. Barrett asks, says Forney Brown, a nursery in Santa Rosa has heirloom starts for $4 each. You order online and they will put them in your car.
Perfect.
That's an option. Glinda says, do you prefer heirloom seeds for food security because you ensure having seeds always?
Well, so I prefer heirlooms because of flavor. And we're going to get into that in a minute. I have a blend. I view this as a portfolio risk management thing. So I have a spectrum of plants. I have some hybrids and some heirlooms. I have small, medium, and large tomatoes. I have short days to maturity to medium, not long. And then I have the colors and flavors that our family likes. So to me, it's a portfolio thing more than anything.
Okay, Olivia says Cottage Gardens in Petaluma has a nice selection of tomato starts right now. Mix of cool coastal ones and ones for warm areas. So that's good.
Perfect.
And C&L Native Nursery is also doing deliveries within Marin and has a good selection. So that's it for comments and questions right now.
Okie doke. So companion plants. There are cultural benefits that accrue from planting onions, nasturtiums, marigolds, asparagus, carrots, parsley, cucumbers in the area around tomatoes. I particularly focus on pollinators. So nasturtiums and marigolds, because they attract pollinators. Because to me, this, and parsley, by the way, oddly enough, just because I use a lot of it. But to me, there's a symbiotic relationship between having pollinators at the end of every vegetable row and trying to have a good harvest. And because tomatoes are self-pollinating. And by the way, the tomato whisperer for pollination is James Campbell, who will be speaking this afternoon. He can tell you all about the tuning forks and things. But basically, the plants vibrate at a certain wavelength, and that causes the pollen to move within the plant. And bumblebees and native species bees are helping the pollination because the vibration of their wings. The wind helps, but you'll have some years with poor pollination, and it can be a variety of things. But some years are just not good. So now we get to planting. So I lay plants out 2 to 3 feet apart. You want to have them staggered so that the front row, if you're doing 2 rows, the front row is not directly lined up on the stem of the back row, because then it will block it for sunlight. So you want to sort of stagger the rows, and you want to be aligned to the south and to the west. And if you're planting determinates and indeterminates, put the determinates to the sun side and the indeterminates behind them, because they'll grow taller. When you take a plant, I'll show you in a minute, you pinch off the bottom 50% of the plant's branches. Don't touch the little cilia on the stem, and you bury it 50% below ground. And the reason is that stem that you've now pruned the branches off, or leaves, that will now become roots. And so you've doubled the root mass in the next 2 weeks by doing that. I plant the plants and then lay out the irrigation and test it. And then you put the scaffolding in, and then you stake. Tomatoes, unlike beans, do not have hands, so they can't grasp anything. So you need to tie them up as they go. And quite often, people's problems with their tomato gardens is that they didn't lay them out well. And examples, there's this sort of cone-shaped scaffolding that's wire that you buy that's only 2 or 3 feet tall, 4 feet maybe, and you put a cherry tomato in that and it can grow 12 feet. So when it gets tall enough, it's going to fall over. Or they didn't tie the plant to the scaffolding. Or they've lined the plants up, and so the back row is getting screened by the front row. Or they didn't stake the scaffolding down enough so that when the plants get really big, the whole thing falls over because of the weight that's up in the air. So quite often, this planting, don't rush through it and think through it as you go and make sure that you've done all the steps, because you're doing something that's going to produce a lot of volume fairly quickly of biomass, and then fruit. There's a lot of weight there. If it's a windy spot, the wind can blow these things down on a bad day, which I've had happen to me. And so you just need to be conscious of, you know, have I put this up strong enough that it will withstand the summer? The 50% burying, the plant on my left, which you see in my hand, that's my hand holding it. We pinched off the lower branches, and the picture in the middle is that plant planted. So it was about a 6 or 8 inch tall plant, and we left the top 3 or 4 inches. The rest was underground. If you buy a plant that is really tall, sometimes you see stringy plants. Those are actually wonderful, but you have to pinch the lower branches off and lean them on their side and then plant them. And just remember where that is so that when you put in the stakes and the scaffolding, you don't put the stake through the plant like I've done. So before we move on, any questions about planting? Because this is pretty important, okay?
Let me see. It looks like we might be coming to a period of slightly warmer weather. I think that's no questions yet on the chat.
The question is, optimally, you'd be planting in 55-degree or warmer weather. Right now in Larkspur, I'm looking at the weather app right now. We don't have that kind of weather forecast yet. But to be honest with you, my tomatoes went in 2 weeks ago because I had a panic attack. Susan's much better at delaying her panic attacks than I am. So Susan, when are you planning to plant?
I haven't even bought my tomatoes yet, so probably at the end of April.
See, much better at this panic thing than I am. But the truth,
my beds are all ready.
Exactly. Somewhere between Susan and I had an anxiety attack about there wouldn't be any plants available, so I went and bought them.
Joe, Jeff was wondering, what's the reasoning behind the slanted planting hole?
If you get one of these, one year the Master Gardeners had these monster 12-inch tall plants that we were selling, and everybody said, well, maybe we should discount because they're not what you normally see in the market. And it turned out those were some of the best plants we've ever had, because laying them on their side, it meant you didn't have to dig a 10-inch deep hole to plant it, for one. And for two, it lets you prune the leaves off until the top 3 or 4 inches. And so all of that stem became root mass. So it just optimized for root growth better. Did that answer your question?
So the next question from Ellen, do you put any kinds of amendments in the planting hole?
So no, I don't. And the reason is I found that if you've been building your soil year round with compost, the soil is very rich already, and nutrient rich is what I'm really looking for, and biologically active. The only time I've used additives was the time I bought sterile soil accidentally when I changed houses, and I used an additive to get through that summer's tomato crop. And then after that, I was able to build the soil back up. But normally I don't. Additives are expensive, and if you've been using compost consistently, you shouldn't need them.
Diane asks, will you be presenting more about scaffolding?
Yes, it's coming up. It's my big finish.
So Ellen also wants to know, is it better to wait until it's warmer to plant, warmer than right now?
Yes, technically yes, unless you're like me and you have an anxiety attack.
And then of course, Isabel saying, I planted my tomato starts 2 weeks ago. Is that too early? So I guess we'll find out from you two later, right?
Well, as long as we don't have a frost, we're fine. If
Good.
you have a frost, you've got to run out and cover your plants.
Is it too late to put compost on your soil prior to planting?
No. You know, so compost can be hot, meaning it's still a little ripe. But if you get compost on the soil a week to 2 weeks before planting, you're fine.
Okay.
Worst case, I've done it the same day and just blended it a bit with what was already there, so it wasn't too hot.
Okay. Thank you.
If there is a frost and you say to cover the plants, is that like the whole plant itself or just like the ground around it?
No. We'll handle this in the vegetable talk, but
Okay.
you just, so the range of ways you can do this, there's a woman in Mill Valley who goes to yard sales and collects umbrellas. And so her frost covering is a bunch of umbrellas stuck in the ground over her plants. And she assures me it's very elegant and looks great, but it works. Other people buy expensive frost cover, material. The key is to keep it up off the plants and off the leaves of the plants, but to make it so that you've created a tent and the plant is inside. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Rita asks, when positioning plants at a slant, does the central stem curve to grow straight?
Yes, it's kind of amazing.
That's great. Olivia asks, if a root ball is root bound, should you tease the roots apart? Do plants?
Absolutely. No matter what plant you're planting, root bound plants, you've got to kind of use your little hand rake tool, if you have one of those, and scritch around the edges to get the leaves, the branch, the root system pointing outward rather than inward. Absolutely. Regardless of what you're planting, you should do that.
Great. All right, that's it for questions on the chat list.
Okay, we'll keep moving. So about containers, I started asking people 7 years ago in Marin, how many of you are container gardeners? And depending upon where you are in the county, it's somewhere between a third and half the people you'll be talking to. And it's important when you're trying to help someone to first ask, are you in the ground, raised bed, or container? And if you're planting your garden, if you had no containers, if you own none yet, but you're going to go buy them, you want the 5 gallon or greater with drainage holes. Ideally, if you're 15 gallon or greater, you can treat it almost like a raised bed. But at 5 gallon, that's sort of the minimum to have a tomato plant. Then the other thing to be aware of is you do want the drainage holes, but you do not want a dish sitting underneath them because the plant shouldn't sit in water. And that's a really important point because an awful lot of people have dishes sitting there full of water. It's a bad idea for a couple reasons. One, it promotes root rot in the plant. Two, it promotes mosquitoes. So you don't want that. And we'll deal with this more in irrigation in the next slide, but how big of a container and how deep is very fundamental to the success of growing tomatoes. Now, irrigation, I think we're in a drought year. I'm not sure, but I think we are. And this kind of ebbs and flows. You could significantly reduce the amount of water you give your tomatoes and they would survive because they are semi-arid plants. The reality is we all want to optimize the harvest. So you want to water in the early morning, you don't want to use gray water, and you want to have the water directed to the root system of the plant, not to the plant. So as children, we watered vegetables, if you remember, and we just dumped water on the plants. And there was this idea of keeping the leaves clean. I don't know where that came from. Maybe only in my family, in Seattle, of all places. But what you want to do is you're watering the soil because the roots are going to absorb the water. And you want to be as directive as possible and not not broadcast it, but narrowcast it to the plants. This frequency of watering. So a tomato plant, what we call tomatoes, they call babies. So the tomato is trying to reproduce. So when you first plant it, you should be watering 3 times a week until you see flowers. And then you dial it back to maybe twice a week. And then once you see fruit, you're dialing it back to once a week or once every 10 days. Now, what's going on? In the beginning, you're trying to promote root growth. And as soon as the flowers start to appear, what you're trying to signal to the plant is you're going into the dry season and it better produce this fruit. And then in the dry season, what you're trying to do is maximize fruit production. Now, the other thing you're doing, though, is increasing flavor, and I'll get to that a little later. But this 3-2-1 thing, the twist on this is if you're in a container gardening situation, you might be watering more frequently in smaller amounts. Because if you're seeing water flow out the bottom of your containers, you're running the water for too long. And you need to play with this because some parts of the county are hotter, drier, and windier. And so the length of watering might be longer. You've got to play with, everybody's garden is different. But this is one of the really fundamental things about tomato gardens and irrigation. Any question about this? Because this is sort of important.
Jeff asks, would a soaker hose throughout the bed work okay for irrigation?
Oh, hell yes. I mean, I've done it. You're using more water than you should, but that's okay. It works.
And Glenda asks, what are your thoughts on fabric containers?
Fabric containers. I don't like velour. I mean, and felt. I'm not, or corduroy. I'm not a big no, I don't know. What are fabric containers?
Glenda, can you tell him? Unmute yourself.
There you go. There are these black cloth pots with handles, and they come in different sizes, so you can get them, you know, really huge ones or smaller ones. And they come in black and tan, and they have really good drainage. And also people say they're great because it allows more oxygen to reach the roots. And they're handy in terms of being able to move around the garden into sunnier spots. And yeah, it's just another type of pot.
Yeah, I haven't worked with them. I don't know. I think one of my concerns is if we're in a drought, you're trying to reduce evaporation. So I don't know if those evaporate more. On the other hand, my aunt, God rest her soul, was an unbelievable tomato gardener with those upside down baskets in Seattle.
What?
And where you pour the water in the top and the water kind of comes through I don't know if you've seen them. The plant literally is upside down, hanging from the rafters of the house on a deck. So there are all kinds of interesting containers that I haven't experimented with. So I haven't worked with a cloth one. But it does bring up an interesting anecdote. I was giving this class in Mill Valley, and a couple came up, and the guy asked me, is it okay to move your plants around to get 6 hours of sun in a day? And I looked at him and said, sure, I guess. I don't know. And he walked away, and I asked his wife, what's the deal? And she said, well, he's a retired Navy guy, and the sun moves across our deck during the day. So I've been going to house sales, yard sales, and buying little red wagons. And he's put all the tomatoes on little red wagons, and he drags them around the deck during the day to stay in the sun. And I said, really? And she said, well, it keeps him busy. So yeah, there's a bunch of people who do a bunch of things to grow tomatoes in places that are not that conducive. So maybe the cloth bags work. I don't know. Any other questions, Kay?
That's it for now.
Okay, but this, if you're thinking about it, 3, 2, 1, what you're also doing in that July, September window is by not flooding your tomatoes with more water, your yield will be slightly lower, your flavor will be higher, and the frequency of cherries cracking because of too much water will be less. So scaffolding and tying. The little scaffold in the middle is the one I was talking about. Those are the ones you see in garden supply stores the most. And if they aren't 6 or more feet tall, most tomato plants are bigger than the scaffolding. And I've seen in the past a tendency for them to fall over. So I use a combination of wire fencing that I've cut in 6.5 foot length so that you can curl it around in a circle and tie it off. And then the plant is staked in the middle, and as it grows, it reaches out, and then you're tying it to the outside scaffolding. This is in a garden where you have 3 feet of depth to play with. If you're planting against a vertical wall and it's a narrower bed, you put the scaffolding against the wall. The other thing to note is when you're tying up tomato plants, you want to not tie them so tightly that they can't continue to grow and they can't move in the breeze. I've seen people very tight ties and then the plant chokes off. So it's just something to be aware of. And now pruning. If you imagine your arm is a tomato plant, and if you where you fold your arm and on the opposite side of your elbow, where the crease is, if a sucker would be the little branch that starts to grow in the crease between an existing stem and an existing branch of a tomato plant. Really, the only pruning you should do, other than for height considerations, is just keep picking away suckers so that you've maximized the nutrient flow to the main branching you want to promote. Suckers aren't inherently bad, it just diminishes the nutrient flow to main branching. But it used to be we did more pruning on tomatoes, and I'll explain more in the flavor section why I've stopped recommending that. But if you can keep the suckers down and kind of have in your head, what are the key branches you want to have and how do you want to maximize production? This is really the only pruning you need to do. And then harvesting. It's important to remember a couple key things. One, the days to maturity are under certain idealized conditions, and every year is different. We have early years, we have late years, we have cool summers, we have hot summers, we have rainy summers. So it can be all over the map. And the truth is, tomatoes ripen best on the vine, except heirlooms can continue to ripen, but can be ripe before they completely turn color. So color alone is not your best indicator. So I find the best thing to do is when you start to get in the zone of when you think your harvest should be, you should be out every day feeling your tomatoes, seeing if there's a softness when they're just right there, and if they come off the vine easily. And it's a very important to taste test, very important. I can't emphasize enough that ultimately when to harvest is taste driven. But when you see people who've let the plants go too long, or they're trying to ripen their fruit in the kitchen on the counter, it's not a good idea. Ripen them on the vine, and then once you get into the harvest season, in my case, I'm harvesting every day. We have tomatoes basically sometime in July till the end of September, almost every day. That's your goal.
Joe, can I ask a couple of questions?
Sure.
We get past the scaffolding. Jeff asks what material works best for tying to scaffolding? And Diane asked the same question. What do you recommend using for ties?
So I've used the green string, the twine. I've used the specialized ties. I've used pretty much all kinds of things. The key is to stay on it. You should be, kind of. I walk around with whatever I'm using for ties in my back pocket every day when I'm looking at the garden, because there'll be something that needs tying up, and just be careful that you haven't created tight binds that prevent plant growth. But I use, I use a lot of it, so I've sort of optimized for not spending as much money as I could on that. Did that answer the question?
I think so. Jeff also asked.
I wanted to confirm. So like twine to me is kind of rough, and I was wondering if it would rub on the stem and possibly cause damage versus like I've seen like the plastic green, and then also wire, kind of like training wire that has the rubber around it. Would the plastic and rubber options be better than twine, or is there not really a concern for damaging the stem from the friction of the twine?
I have, Jeff, the twine, I haven't seen it as a problem, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper, and also it's biodegradable. So
I love everything about that answer. So thank you.
You'll find that I keep trying to find ways to not spend money on gardening, because I find all these other ways to spend money on gardening. So, it's a tension in me, but the gardening twine is fine.
Great, thank you.
And Jeff also asks, for pruning suckers, do garden snips work better than simply pinching with fingers? Is there any concern for rough wounds not healing quickly?
Ideally, if you have your scissors with you, great. If not, keep one thumbnail a little longer than you normally would, and you're fine. Any other questions, Kay?
Oh, wow. Olivia just sent a monster question. Sorry, back to soil. I plant a zillion tomatoes in large 20-gallon plastic pots. Every season I have to dump the last year's soil somewhere because I don't want to reuse it and infect the new year's batch. I also attempt to sterilize the pots with bleach dilution. Then I have to buy a ton of new bags of soil to refill all the pots anew. It's a lot of work and it's expensive. Are tomato pathogens so persistent that I should keep sterilizing? Is there a good bulk soil company that you trust that sells a good ready blend for tomatoes in containers, assuming bulk would be cheaper than float bags? Thanks.
Okay. So here's what you're doing right. And there's more on container gardening in the vegetable section. The dilemma in container gardening is a couple-fold. One, that your containers, you're pouring water through and you're leaching out all of the nutrients. So you have this constant thing of between seasons, how do you maintain the soil in containers? You have a second problem, which is if there are viruses in the soil, there are ways to compensate for that. For example, growing hybrids or crop rotation. But if you're going to grow the same variety in the same container year after year, then what you're doing is probably the most prudent thing to do. There are bulk soil providers for container gardens. I would just say call the help desk. I'm not supposed to promote anyone. But what you're actually doing is pretty close to what I do with my containers, except I do crop rotation, so I'm less worried about the soil. I dump the soil out once a year, get everything out, roots, children's toys, gloves, garden tools that got lost. And then I add more compost into the mix and then refill the containers. And with the extra soil, I just spread it in the garden. But that's because I crop rotate in those containers. But if you're not doing crop rotation, then what you're doing is actually the right thing to do. Did that answer the question, Kay?
Olivia, is that
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much.
okay? Good. That's it for questions so far, Joe.
Okay. So let's talk about flavor. One of the reasons you should grow tomatoes is you want to get the best flavor possible. And this is a noble endeavor. This is goodness. But let me be clear on what is flavor. There's three things going on in your brain at the same time. It's the fruit you see, the color, the shape. There's how it tastes in your mouth and throat. And then it's how it smells. And those three things are, your brain is processing three of them and tells you what the total of that is how you think it tastes. That's the flavor. So it's sight, feel, taste in the mouth, and then the smell factor. The problem is that big agriculture over the last 100 years didn't worry about flavor. They worried about yield and disease resistance and shipping and things like that. So hybrid plants tended to be less flavorful, and store tomatoes less flavorful, but easier to produce. The problems with the research in flavor is that there are profound differences between men and women, foodies and non-foodies, older people and younger people, and the same variety in different regions of the country. So to kind of crystallize this, flavor is in the brain of the beholder, in my opinion. And you'll meet, here are the hot spots for flavor. Anybody from New Jersey swears to God they're the best tomatoes in the world, or from the deep South, for whatever reason. So you have this dilemma. So if you're trying, and this is just recent, frankly, there wasn't that much research on flavor, optimizing for flavor in tomatoes until the last 5 or 10 years. But you want to make sure that you have enough phosphorus and potassium and other nutrients in the ground. The longer the sunlight, the more the sunlight, the longer, the better, because you want higher sugar content. Vine ripening enhances the flavor over having something on a counter. If you pick it underripe, it'll be less sweet, more sour, less tomato-like. My own personal belief is the time between picking and eating should be minimized. So if you're going to have people for dinner, it's always great to take them out and pick the tomatoes that you're going to eat in half an hour. And refrigeration is a nightmare because it puts the tomato into shock and it starts damaging the flavor almost immediately. So then there's this interesting research that says smaller fruit tends to be ascribed with higher flavor, in fact, because it's higher sugar. So sweet 100s and sun golds, cherries, are almost like eating candy. The color of the fruit, there's a bunch of research, pardon me, stand for a while. There's a bunch of research where in some cases they believe orange or yellow tomatoes are milder and less acidic than red, or that black have more complex flavors. But it's not necessarily true. It just means that it could be that the person eating that prefers those colors. But what is interesting is foliage. Because leaves capture sunlight, a plant with more leaves generates more sugar and other flavorful components. So heirloom varieties, one of the reasons they think it may be more flavorful than hybrids is heirlooms tend to have more leaves than hybrids. And within hybrids, the smaller the fruit and the determinants tend to have higher flavor than the indeterminates. So if you're trying to grow a flavorful tomato, A really rich soil with compost and where you know your past potassium and sulfur is good is important. The watering sparingly is important. Sunlight, intense sunlight is critical. And ideally you want temperatures that are in the 80s during the days and 50 and 60s at night. If it gets hotter than that, you have fruit setting problems. And if it's lower than that, the plant won't produce flavor compounds as effectively. So this is not in your book. It won't be on your test, but I actually find this is something that people ask me about a lot. Any questions about the flavor component in tomatoes? Okay.
I don't see any questions about flavor. Tanya just asks a question about rotating. When rotating your crop, can you toggle between 2 plots, giving each plot 1 season to rest?
Yes. Yes. You can even, if you only had a single plot and you have 2 rows, you can flip it. But ideally, each similar season, so every spring, summer, you're not growing tomatoes in the same place. Does that make sense?
So Linda asks, would you shade tomato plants if temps go above 80 degrees during the summer months?
No, but if it gets over 100, yes. You can, I move my patio umbrella over. And here's the trick with, this is where, it's a very good question actually. If you walk out at midday and your plants are wilting, that's okay. They're just dealing with the heat. If you come out in the morning and they're wilted, you need to water more. So how you play the day out, we get these heat waves. We had heat a couple years ago, around 105 to 110 here. It was murderous on my vegetable garden. And I put up shade for that, sort of after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, because the hottest part of the day is 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I was trying to shade the plants from the hottest part of the day. Did that answer your question?
So Arlene asks, what about humidity for tomato growing?
I haven't seen a lot of research for that for California. You run into more humidity related research in the southeast, and it has to do with dealing with mildews, but also they claim it improves flavor. But I haven't researched it here.
Richard asks, what type of mulch do you recommend around tomatoes?
If you plant them within 2 or 3 feet of each other, green mulch is the canopy of leaves that the ground itself will be in the shade of the plant. So I don't use mulch for tomatoes. Other people I know do, and if you're in a cooler climate, one of the tricks is to use gravel, round stones, because they get warmed up in the heat and they help the plant stay warm.
Ellen asks, has anyone propagated tomatoes from cuttings? I have less access to tomato plants this year. I propagate dahlias this way.
So if you know Woody, Susan, help me. Woody, what is Woody's last name? 1 year,
Reynolds.
pardon me?
Reynolds?
Yes. So 1 year we tried, there's this whole trick of you buy rootstock and then you buy the variety you want, beefsteaks and things, and you graft. There's tomato grafting. That was an interesting experiment. But I haven't seen anybody propagating tomato plants from cuttings.
That's all for questions right now.
Okay, thanks, Kay. So that was the portion on flavor. And it won't be on your test, but it's amazing how often it comes up in the real world. So if we are going into drought, you might see plants that have this yellowing and wilting. And you're worried if you see if you see wilting in the morning, that's low water potentially. You may have pollination problems. If we have a hot June, that can be a problem, or it's not windy, or it's humid. I haven't found any good solutions to when we don't get good pollination, but this can be a factor. The common tomato problems in Marin, we have a set of pests and we have a set of diseases. And so let me go through this. But by the way, if you go to IPM, here's the whole list. And just let me go back up 1 second. As a master gardener, a lot of what we do is teach people how to research solving problems themselves. And so to the degree that you can help people learn how to use IPM, and you don't have to be a scientist, you just need to be able to match what you're seeing on your plant with what's on the screen. And this skill is probably one of the big ahas to many people, because the inclination is to go to a nursery right away, and you know, they'll sell you something which you may or may not need. And it's part of our key. I think when we think about it, master gardeners are this technical transfer from the horticultural schools to the public. But the other part of the transfer is a skill set to want people to do their own research and figure things out. So when you're into IPM, part of what you're teaching is you can figure this out. You're trying to build people's confidence. So for example, blossom end rot, cat facing, fruit cracks, sun scald, leaf roll. These are environmental disorders. Everybody gets this sooner or later. Verticillium wilt, this is one of these viruses in the soil. So once you know you have this problem, if you're doing in-ground planting, you should switch to hybrids. Once you figure this out, you switch to hybrids, because then you want a plant-resistant variety, which are labeled with a V. Or if you find that this is the case and your soil has the disease, you can put a container on top of the soil, making sure you have gravel underneath to kind of isolate the container from the soil, and plant tomatoes in the same place, but not worry about what's in the soil. Fusarium, well, same thing. Again, you'll see these yellowing, and this, if you cut the plant in half, the vascular system's dying. So you plant resistant varieties, get rid of all the roots and everything that was there before. You could solarize your soil, but if you're planting in ground in Marin, in all likelihood, the soil will be infected already. The tomato psyllid, you'll see the leaves curling and you'll see these little critters. I pick off the infected parts of the plant immediately and get them out of the garden. So don't put them in your personal compost, put them in the green bin that's going away. Blossom end rot is a classic problem. It's a lack of calcium, or there could be high salt content. So you want to look at soil fertilization and amendments. I had this very bad one year, and it was because we were getting offshore wind, and we were actually getting a lot of evaporation of the soil. Oh, and the calcium, I had not had enough. I had not had a good compost that year and didn't realize it. Cat facing, you've seen these. It could be cool and cloudy weather at the bloom time. They're disease-resistant varieties if you're worried about this. I have had years where I've had none of it. I've had other years where I had quite a bit. And then fruit cracking. And this again, it can be a water problem. It could be that the leaf canopy is not complete. There are some disease-resistant ones. You should look up an IPM to check what you're looking at. And sun scald. If you are pinching back leaves in your plants, it could end up that you're exposing the fruit and it's going to burn the skin. So you want to make sure that the plant has sufficient leaf cover to avoid this. Leaf roll, it's an indication of a wet spring condition. The plant may look wilted as a result. You don't need to do anything. It won't harm the plant. The plant will kind of grow out of it. Just keep an eye on it. So I know that that's an awful lot of stuff. My belief is you need to look at your plants every day. And if you see anything starting to look the least bit wonky, then you should jump on it, because what you don't want to do is have it spread. And so I'm out almost from now until October at one point every day, and you just check your plants. You just walk through the garden and look for things. A much better tomato gardener than me, Susan, I'm sure, does the same thing. Susan, what do you think?
At least once a day. Because it's so healing just to be out in the garden.
Ah, right. It's good for you and it's good for the garden. So any questions? I'm sorry this is so much information on the disease side. Truth is, every year you're going to have some problem. So you should just pay attention and jump on it as early as possible.
There's one question from Jeff. I think it has to do with Verticillium. Before the shelter in place, I was working at a nursery, and this is a very common issue. People want quick fixes with a spray or product rather than diagnosing what is actually going wrong. It's a hard balance to walk as a master gardener. So that's really a comment more than
And you're completely right. So I have a friend who's incredibly smart. I don't know why he hangs out with me, but anyway, and I was at his house and he said, you know, can you tell me what's wrong with these tomato plants? And it was clear they had Verticillium wilt. And I said, well, you have a soil virus. How long have you planted tomatoes here in this spot in the ground in your garden? And he said, well, we've lived here 30 years and that's where I've always planted because that's where I have the most sun. So he's never crop rotated. And I said, well, there's nothing to spray here. The fact is you've got a wilt. So either you've got to plant hybrids, and he only liked heirlooms, or get pots and put them on top of the soil so that you can grow the plant you like, but it's going to be above ground. And we did the latter. But you're exactly right. People want a quick solution to this. And if it's a ground virus, there is no quick solution. Any other questions, Kay?
Oh, there are a couple. Linda just asked one, is there anything you can do to help pollination if there is no wind and fewer bees? Can you vibrate the plant yourself?
So ask James Campbell when he speaks, because he's my pollination plant whisperer. I don't think so, but he may know a solution.
We can remember that Linda can, we can ask him later this afternoon.
Yeah, I do this to him every year. I tell everybody to talk to him about pollination problems and vibrating the plant.
Yeah, and bumblebees are the primary pollinators, and they're everywhere almost all day long. So people are talking to each other on the chat list. How do you tell the difference between Verticillium and Fusarium?
You know, the leaves look slightly different. And frankly, you see yellowing on the leaves and versus yellowing in the vines. I don't get that sophisticated. I would buy a hybrid that has VNF protection.
Yeah. Because we've had one plant in my garden, and I was never sure exactly which one. I think it was the Verticillium that we
Right.
had. Yeah, yeah. That was my question.
Oh, all right. Any others, Kay?
I don't see any more on the list.
Okay, so let me just, sorry, I'm catching back up with where we were. So at a macro level, tomatoes are what probably 70% of the people you'll meet in Marin grow. You can either be a beginner, an experienced, or an uber gardener, and every year is a different set of challenges. And the basic parameters are pretty clear. You need 6 hours of sunlight, so where you plant will determine what you plant. So if you're in a cool climate in a container, you have a constrained palette of plants to choose from. If you're in ground or in raised beds, you can grow a wider range. If you're in a hot part of the county, you can grow everything. I believe that fundamentally you're growing your soil and that grows the plant. So you really focus on soil management to make this work, which means compost and if needs be mulch. You can very easily overwater or underwater, and the difference between container gardening and in ground or raised beds is the container gardening, your frequency of watering might be higher, but the quantity per time of watering will be less. You don't want water running out the bottom. And then as you go from the first planting to flower to fruit, you want to decrease your water supply to promote fruit growth and flavor. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's basically the whole thing, is these 4 or 5 things. Okay, that was to you. I'm
oh yeah, absolutely.
Being in the room with people.
I know. Well, everybody's they can unmute themselves and ask questions too. I mean, that's always a way we can go. There is one more question.
Okay.
Melissa asks, should you use a water meter in a tomato container garden?
You know, I don't know. I'm not a gadget person. I'm kind of, I watch the plants and I stick my fingers into things, and I fuss around probably too much, but I'm not a gadgety person, so I'm the wrong guy to ask. Sorry.
Well, that's the last question in the chat group. Is did you want to take a break, Joe, or do we have more in the tomato?
No, I think. Let me see. I think we're. I was trying not to drive you all into a stupor. So this has been. You've been putting up with me for about an hour and 15 minutes. So, Kay, do you want to take a break and then we'll come back? Are
you through with the tomato portion,
yes.
Joe?
Yes.
Okay. Well, maybe now would be a good time to take a break, and then the vegetable portion after 15 minutes.
All right. So why don't we restart at 11:15?
So I think that sounds great. So 11:45, everybody.
Okay.
I know this is a weird venue, isn't it, when you can't see and talk to everybody?
Well, no, I think it's probably now I can see everybody, and you're very kind to put up with it this way. I'm just thrilled that you want to be in the class and learn these things. It's wonderful. So thank you all. So we'll be back at 11:15. Okay.
That sounds great.
Right. We'll see you in a minute.
I think we are, Joe. It is right 10:45 sharp. Let's go.
All right. Do we have everybody?
I think they'll gather really quickly now.
Okie doke. So let's start with the core kind of set of things about vegetable gardening. You still have the same right plant, right place, compost, compost, mulch, mulch mantras. And we'll go through classifications, planting, preparing, caring, harvesting, and IPM. But pulling the camera way back, an awful lot of the people I meet who grow any food crop in Marin mainly grow tomatoes. And I try to urge people every year to try something new, keep adding to their palate. And because it's fun, and also you're trying to show them that there's a bigger world out there. So just to be clear, you know, a vegetable is basically a herbaceous plant that has some edible part. And an herb is a seed producing annual, biannual, or perennial used for aromatic, medicinal, or savory purposes. We're going to do vegetables first and then herbs. To give you an idea how important vegetable gardening is, so for example, beans originally appear in Asia, Africa, America, and the European continents. Ancient Native Americans grew beans, corn, and squash. They were called the Three Sisters. Beets are from the Mediterranean region and were grown by the ancient Greeks as a sacred crop and aphrodisiac. Carrots are from Central Asia, domesticated in Afghanistan around 900 CE. Cauliflowers from the Mediterranean, first mentioned in the 6th century BCE. Leeks are from the Mediterranean. They're actually found on the walls of ancient Egyptian tombs. Lettuce is from the Mediterranean era region, first cultivated 2,000 years BCE. Rhubarb is from Siberia and China, and it was in a Chinese herbal guidebook from 2700 BC. Spinach is from Central and Southwestern Asia, first mentioned in Persia, 640 BCE. The reason I bring this up is these vegetables have interesting histories, interesting origin stories. They are core to our global culture. And so one of the fun things is learning more about different vegetables and trying them. And then particularly when you're with children, telling them the context and the history. They may still not eat them, but they'll be at least better educated in their rejections. So in planning your vegetable garden, I hate to give you this long list, but this is now the full Megillah of vegetable gardening. So we'll go through all of this. But let's look at San Rafael, for example. As a vegetable gardener, I'm most worried about, and this is year-round vegetable gardening now, is when does it rain and when does it freeze? And so historically, we can get freezing weather in San Rafael basically from September to May. And what that means is if you're doing year-round vegetable gardening, you pretty pay attention checking what's the weather going to be tonight, because it can sneak up on you. And then in addition, you have to know your vegetable garden. If you're on flat ground at the bottom of a ridge or hill or in a dip, your temperatures could be 2 or 3 degrees cooler than what's forecast. So you have to pay attention to freezing. The other thing to pay attention to is even though the rain chart in the right-hand corner of this slide shows you average precipitation, our actuals have been all over the map. So we've had numerous Januaries since I've given this presentation where it didn't rain for a month in the middle of the rainy season. And so if you're a vegetable gardener and you think it's going to be raining all winter, your plants could be out dying because there's been no rain for weeks. So you have to kind of pay attention, when did it last rain, when is it going to rain again, to know whether or not to turn your irrigation on during your winter season. Now, for hours of sunlight, vegetable gardens need 6 hours or more. And frankly, I've run into people who have 6 hours of sunlight and had someone lay out their garden for aesthetic purposes, and it may not align the rows of the garden to the sunlight. So the second thing about sun is being aligned to the sun. And this is impossible to do on Zoom, but okay, so everybody has a right and left side of their screen. If the left side was the west and the right side was the east, and behind me was the south, and behind the screen was the east, the north, you want your beds aligned on the east-west axis facing south to maximize sunlight. If you're in cooler climates and you have a rock wall or a fence or a house that's facing west, you might want to plant along that because that wall will retain and reflect heat. And so the other thing to think about in terms of hours of sunlight is you want the tall plants to the north or the back of the shorter plants, because otherwise they'll put them in the shade as they grow. So if you're trying to help someone with their garden and their plants are not coming in very well, one of the first questions is, how many hours of sunlight do you get, and how is your garden aligned to the sun? Does that make sense? Because it's a really basic problem you run into. Okay, any questions on this? I'll take that as a no.
I was muted, Joe. Yes, no questions so far on chat.
Okay. So then the second thing to know about vegetable gardening is there are really only 3 frameworks. There may be a 4th one emerging, but let's leave it with these 3 for now. You can plant in ground or in raised beds or in some kind of container. Now, theoretically, in ground, you can grow all varieties. But if you have viruses in the soil, you would adjust with hybrids. You have to have Gopher wire or Gopher cages to protect your garden. And the interesting thing is actually in ground uses the least water and fertilizer because it's drawing groundwater and nutrients from the soil around it. A raised bed, and if it's a really large raised bed, it's very similar to in ground. Theoretically, all varieties will grow there. You're recycling soil, and if you found that you had a virus, you can clean it out and start over. You absolutely have to have Gopher wire across the bottom of the raised beds, or you've just created a buffet for them. And it reuses about the mid-range or average amount of irrigation and fertilizer. Now, containers are different. You'll want varieties that grow in that container size and depth. You want to pay attention to the soil because you're basically flooding it with water. And we'll talk about how to replace the soil or augment the soil to address viruses. The good news is containers, gophers are not your issue, but irrigation's trickier. So you want to irrigate more frequently, but in shorter periods, smaller amounts. So I haven't run into that many people that are doing all 3 at the same time, but I run into a lot of people who have containers and a raised bed, or containers and in ground. But then a lot of our community has just containers. They are the condos and townhouses, and all they have is a deck, or they live on a very steep sloped property and their containers are on their deck. Or they live in a tree area and they only have sun in one place, and many times it's in the front yard next to the driveway. So understanding container gardening is very important to most of the public in Marin, one way or the other.
Joe,
So,
couple of
questions? Yes,
Yeah.
Kay.
Diane asks, what do you think about weather station irrigation systems, particularly in winter, to adjust irrigation time depending on if it will rain or not?
It's a hell of a good idea. It automates what I do personally, which is I go out and check, and I keep an eye on the rain, on the wetness of the soil. I would probably do it, except I'm a little cheap, but someday maybe it'll be a birthday present.
Charisse asked, is it worthwhile to install weed barrier at the bottom of raised beds, like weed barrier fabric?
I haven't found it necessary, but I know other people who put raised beds literally right on top of either lawns or weedy areas that had lots of weeds already growing, in which case, yes.
Okay, next question from Jeff. I have tall raised beds and have started to install gopher wire along the bottoms, about 2 feet down. Is that deep enough to allow plant root growth for most veggies?
It's interesting. So the way that I put in gopher wire is before you build your raised bed, the first row of boards that go around, you attach the wire to that, and it's what's sitting flush on the ground. And then if you have a 2 feet or higher raised bed, that's plenty of room for most plants, root growth wise. I have not seen plants trying to go through the root barrier, through the gopher wire into the subsidiary soil. So I don't know if you need to go that much further if you have a deep raised bed.
Okay, that's it for questions so far.
Okay. So I can't see you all because I'm looking at the slides, but I'm assuming that you have a range of people, okay, between the ages of under 50 and over.
Oh yeah, and oh, absolutely.
Okay. Here's the thing. If you're over 30 or 40, what you're trying not to do is fall while gardening. And so you kind of back into this access thing by saying, if I'm planting my garden, how am I going to get on all sides of this vegetable garden? Or am I only going to have access on one side or 2 sides? And then how far can I reach? I've seen people plant 6 foot wide vegetable gardens. You can't reach the inside, the middle, particularly if they have constrained access. So what you're looking for is, if you only have access from one side, probably 24 inches deep is as far as you want to be reaching. And if you have access from 2 sides, 36 to 48 inches, so it's 24 inches from either side, is about as wide as you want it. Height is interesting. Once you get above 18 to 24 inches, what you're doing is the plant probably has plenty of soil mass to grow in, but what you're reducing is how often you're leaning over. So a higher raised bed is easier on your back. And the other thing to think about is, where's my access to water? How easy is it to get compost into this thing and get debris out? And if you're building your own, am I using standard lumber sizes, or am I going to have to do a lot of cutting? And then most importantly, how wide is your wheelbarrow? That should tell you how wide the space between the beds should be. But this access thing is important, because if you kind of lay it out the wrong way, it's very difficult to fix later. Yeah. The second thing is, before you lay out a vegetable garden, go sit in the space at different times of the day and try and see if you can get a sense of how the wind and air moves. An example of a friend of mine's garden in Tam Valley, near Tam Junction in Mill Valley, it has a hell of a lot of wind movement with the fog coming in and going out, and it's cold. It's a physically cold garden. He put up wind blocks, and it's much warmer now. The other thing to notice about this is, if in the winter when it rains, water pools in the garden beds, that means there's not enough drainage, and you don't want water pooling. So you kind of have to, I believe you just, and Susan is a genius at this, by the way. If you ever go to visit her garden, it's incredibly well laid out. But she's laid it out for the sun, she's laid it out for scaffolding, she's laid it out for drainage and access. She's a very good example of a really well thought out vegetable garden. So any question about both access, wind, air, and drainage?
No new questions listed.
Okay. Okay, critters. Depending upon where you are in the county and the season and the year, we go through waves of critter problems. 2 years ago, Mill Valley, it was rats. Other people, moles and voles. Other people, birds. Personal favorite, raccoons, squirrels, and frankly, deer are the ubiquitous, it's just a tall rat. So if you haven't put up fencing and netting and gopher wire, you have basically created a buffet. And to give you an example, a friend in Palo Alto, we built basically a tomato garden for him. And a week later, he called me and said, this isn't working. The squirrels are climbing over on trees and dropping in. And so I went back and we actually covered the top of the garden with wire gopher mesh to keep all the critters out. And now it's a great tomato garden. So the very first thing you have to think about is, how am I going to secure this site, from these critters? And then how do I make sure that I have good access and that I have access to water and those things? So if you have a good location with good sun and you've managed your water access and drainage, and by the way, the closer you are to the kitchen, the more likely you'll use it. And you'll see people overbuild a garden. They'll build a really large one first, which is not a great idea. It's better to build something small and then add to it over time as you become more vegetable garden centric. And the more time you spend to make sure that you've thought through your own personal ergonomics, the better. So plant selection. There's a combination of things here. What grows well in your microclimate? What do you like to eat? What would save you money? What do your neighbors grow? And try something new. Now, the reason I emphasize what do you like to eat is, pardon me for standing up, and the microclimate, if let's say you've moved to a neighborhood, you're brand new, walk around and ask your neighbors what they grow and what varieties of different types of vegetables they grow. You'll get a sense of the palette that does well in your neighborhood. But the problem is still, your garden could be different than the garden next door. And then the second thing is, what do you like to eat and what saves money? Within that, yes, I could grow more artichokes. I just don't like them that much. On the other hand, we grow a hell of a lot of tomatoes and basil because we eat that constantly. And trying something new, I'm always challenging myself to try something new and see if I like it. So when you look at the major plant families, and by the way, this information is core. So the thing about these plant families will be important when we get to crop rotation. And then the other thing to be aware of is cool season versus warm season. So as we go through the year, different crops do well. But even within the year, if you're in a cooler climate, there's some areas that do better growing cool climate vegetables because you can't grow the hot climate vegetables. It's not warm enough. So crop rotation. This is one of the oldest concepts in agriculture. And what it basically boils down to is many pests and diseases winter over in the ground. And if you planted the same crop year after year in the same place, you're basically supplying them, and then you'll get reinfected again. And so you want to think of it as, if you had 3 rows, then you would have a tomato in one row, basil in the second row, and lettuce in a third. Each year you'd move them around so that you wouldn't have the same plant family in the same row 2 years in a row in the summer. It's amazing how many people don't do this. And it means that they're promoting the likelihood of diseases and viruses in their soil. which is a direct outcome. So before I move on, any question on plant families and crop rotation?
A couple of questions, Joe. Ellen asked, can I plant nightshade family plants in the same area as the previous year with good results? For example, rotate the peppers with the tomatoes.
No, because it's the same problem. They all have the same viruses and insects. That's exactly what you're trying to avoid.
Right, I think.
Oh, by the way, I've been guilty of doing that, so I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, Jeff answered that question to the group. So he said, I think crop rotation should be done between
between plant families. That's correct.
Yeah. So in that case, would not be ideal to rotate peppers and tomatoes since they're in the same family. So,
right.
Okay, that's it for questions so far.
So, by the way, this is one of the great joys of living in California. We can basically grow vegetables year round. So this chart is from Pam Pierce's Golden Gate Gardening. Is that still one of the texts for the class, Kate?
Oh, absolutely.
So it's kind of like my Bible, New Testament. And I've managed to get 3 cycles a year. So I have my sort of April, May cycle, my July, August, and my October, November. Theoretically, you could do 4. I just don't have enough garden space. But the reason to think about this is when you're planting your garden, I'm always like, when am I planting? When am I harvesting? And then what's going in after that? So for example, if you're worried about planting tomatoes in April, you shouldn't be planting asparagus or carrots in March because it will be taking up that space. So you have to be thinking about timing and when you'll be planting and when you'll be harvesting and pulling things out. Companion plants, again, we brought this up earlier. If you're planting beans, then corn, savory, or radishes are a good companion. These others are not. I haven't found companion planting. I don't have that much room to manipulate this. So, but this is something that occasionally is on the test. Soil temperatures, I tend to think these are important but not critical. What you're really worried about, if you plant a little early, it won't kill you. What will kill you is a frost or no water. So planting plan, I'm always thinking in terms of when am I going into the ground, when am I harvesting and coming out, what areas need trellising and staking, how much space do I need, succession planting, companion planting, and then intercropping.
Joe, can I ask a quick couple questions on rotating that just popped up?
Sure.
Yeah, Rita wants to know, rotating to next bed over, okay? Just concerned about soil, not diseases transferring to adjacent beds.
Well, no, so that's a good question. So the rotation comes seasonally. So I planted tomatoes every year in April. And so every year in April, I want my tomatoes in a different row or bed or container than the previous year. Ideally, it would be every 3rd year, but I haven't been able to make that work personally. I don't have that much room. So it's what you're trying to do is not promote the same plant family in the same row or bed or container year after year. Did that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess that leads to Shauna's, a question from Shauna too. Does a winter-summer rotation of crops count for crop rotation, or is the 1 year spacing of rotation needed?
It's the 1 year.
And Jeff asks, in square foot gardening, how far apart should rotations be? Can you plant carrots in 1 square for 1 season and then plant carrots next season in the squares immediately adjacent, or should they be further than that?
You know, square foot gardening is tricky because it's so compact. I don't really know the answer to that. I would query either the book, and I don't have my copy with me, I lent it to someone, or on the website for Square Foot Gardening. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, that's it for questions so far.
Okay. So another way to think about this is, what are the projected root depths of the vegetables I'm going to be planting? And this is from our handbook. And one reason to pay attention to this is, if you have a very shallow raised bed or very shallow containers, some things aren't going to do well. So take the carrot, for example. A carrot can have roots 1.5 feet wide to 3 feet deep. And they look like cilia. It's this very thin network of roots. Well, the reason this matters is, in the container world, I get my tape measure out and I measure depth. And ideally, you would buy a whole bunch of containers at the same time that are all 18 to 24 inches deep, in which case anything you wanted to plant could grow there. Well, the reality is, what most of us have are some containers we inherited, something we bought, we have found, I don't know. And so you line them up from, short to tall and measure them, and then it'll tell you the 6 to 10 inch containers. There's a list of things that do well there, 10 to 15 there, 15 to 18. Do not put a tomato in a 6 to 10 inch deep container. It won't work. So this is one of the most basic things about container gardening, is match the plant to the depth of the container. Does this make sense to people? It's an easy screw up, which I've done. And what happens is you get lots of leafy things at the top, but no production. Any questions about container roots? Depth? No?
I don't see anything.
Okay. So the optimal container is 5 gallons or larger. It's plastic. It doesn't have a dish. You're using container soil, outdoor container soil that you replace or amend every year. You're adding compost, and depending upon what you're growing and how much evaporation and weeds you're worried about, you'll mulch. And the interesting thing is, irrigation, you'll need more water than raised beds or in ground, but delivered in smaller doses. And the reason is, the water goes out the bottom. Soil, as I said in the earlier class, what we're really doing as vegetable gardeners is we're growing our soil. And it's possible to get normal Marin soil to work, but it only works if you create a huge amount of organic material to put into it. So ideally, you'd have a mix of water, air, mineral, and organic material. But, oops, sorry for the typo. But the soil prep is pretty much the same. You want to get all the debris from the previous crop out. You want to add compost, and then you want to mulch if necessary. Now, if you're in containers and you want to give a more organic way to provide nutrients, you can put compost in a gallon container, fill it about 1/3 full with compost, pour water into the top, cover it, leave it in the sun for 24 hours, and then remove the cover. Do not breathe in, because it smells, and filter it through some burlap, and you'll have this brown liquid. It's called compost tea. It basically has the nutrients of the compost in the water, and you can use it all over your garden, but particularly in containers, to put nutrients in while you're watering. Any questions about that portion?
Well, there's one question. Debbie asked, do you want to raise containers on feet, or are they better on the ground?
Honestly, I raise them on feet so that I'm sure that the water is, if there is water flowing out, it flows away and it's dry. but you don't have to, but I do.
Okay, that's the only question.
Okay. Okay, trellises and scaffolding. So when you're planting a vegetable garden, scaffolding it's your friend, and it's also a complexity. So what it basically means is there are certain plants that grow up better than across. And there's a whole wide range of scaffolds out there. And it's partially driven by what plant you're growing and how much space you have and how much money you want to spend. But what I have found is at a very simplified level, there's sort of a vertical scaffold, which is just a straight line, which many of these are. And then there's circular or triangular scaffolds. And they allow you to get away with different things. So the straight line lets you basically espalier vegetables. And you'll see it in that middle picture. So you're growing the vegetable up, and if it's something like tomatoes, you're tying it. If it's beans, they're just attaching themselves. Cucumbers, similarly. If you're using the pyramids or the circular ones I use, you're allowing a plant to grow out and up at the same time. But the trick to this is you have to firmly secure your scaffolding into the ground and onto something. And I use steel posts. The reason is an unsecure scaffold, if it gets windy, which it often does here, it'll blow over. So it's one of the considerations to have in mind. The other thing is, if your scaffold is tied to your container and not tied out to a wall or a post or something, if the container is a high one, your center of gravity is moving up, and in the wind it can blow over. Now, pollination. So any questions on scaffolding before we go on to pollination?
None written on chat.
Okay, so you've had the class on pollination, right? Okay.
I think we've touched on it, but I think we're looking to this afternoon to learn a lot about pollination with the bee.
James is the pollination whisperer. Basically, it's how do you transfer pollen within a flower or between flowers for vegetables to produce. And they're self-pollinating, and then one's grown from leaves and roots where it's not as important, and insect pollinating versus self-pollinating. My basic rule of thumb is I want things that attract pollinators, like flowers around my garden. If you go into my garden right now, I've planted all of these blooming flowers that will be in bloom through July to bring as many pollinators to the garden already, so that when the tomatoes and other things come up, they're in a rich pollinating environment. We'll have years where we have pollination problems, but you should be viewing your garden. If you're growing your soil, you're also growing your pollination environment. And so you want to attract as many pollinators as possible. It also makes for a beautiful garden, to be honest with you. Now, caring for your vegetable crop. Irrigation, there's an enormous amount of technical information I find very hard to fathom. So a rule of thumb is you want to, first off, lay out your garden so that similar plants in terms of water needs are on irrigation lines that are similar amounts, because your tomatoes will need less water than your lettuces in August. So if they're all on the same irrigation line, either the lettuce is getting a lot less water than it needs, or the tomato plants are drowning. So you'll see this thing of a gallon of water wets 1 square foot of soil to the depth of 1.6 inches. And I know that's in the guidebook, and I don't know what to do with that data. So, and also you need different amounts of water as you go through the season. So my rule of thumb about irrigating is you should know the rules, and then you should learn your garden and pay attention to your season and crop. And so every year and every crop, it's slightly different challenges in terms of when and how much to water. And you just have to pay attention and adjust it till it feels like it's right and it's working. Does that make sense to people? Because it's, people want like a hard and fast rule. In my experience is that's not really what helps people garden in this area. Any questions about that?
None typed in yet.
Oh, good. I'm on a roll. They're all having lunch or sleeping.
No, they're not.
So how should I irrigate? Ideally, you irrigate in the early morning. And ideally, you irrigate the ground, not the plant. And ideally, you use tap water, not gray water. And ideally, you're paying attention as you go through the year, because your irrigation needs will change as the seasons change. So the last thing to remind everybody about irrigation is probably twice a year. I do it end of September and beginning of April. I walk all of my irrigation lines to make sure that I haven't, using a shovel or hoe, cut them, which I seem to do regularly, or that one of the little emitters hasn't popped out, or whatever. You shouldn't assume that your irrigation system from season to season will work correctly or from year to year. So just turn the system on, walk the whole thing, make sure they're all working and they're cleaned out and working correctly, and then fix anything early, because you don't want to have your irrigation system failing and your plants dying and you not realizing it until it's too late. Now, how do I grow from seeds? I love growing plants from seeds. I think it's one of the coolest things we do. I was just out, in fact, during our break. The Kentucky Blue Wonder beans that I planted and my Italian purples are starting to poke their heads out of the ground, which is, it's great. So the seed world breaks into two groups. Ones that you should direct sow because you're not going to move them, and others where you can start them in cups and then transplant them. And just look at your variety and it'll tell you whether you should direct sow or be able to transplant. Direct sowing, it should have a short germination time, and usually if they have very delicate root systems, so you don't want to transplant them. An example is carrots. So you prep your soil, you make sure you have bird protection, keep an eye out for frost or drought. But basically, the seeds I planted 10 days ago are now coming up. Similarly, I also planted zucchini and eggplants because the bed wasn't ready yet for them in cups. And in about 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks, I'll be transplanting those. What's important when you're looking at the transplant model is watch for, it can get ahead of you and suddenly you have a whole bunch of root-bound plants because you didn't optimize for when to transfer them. So watch carefully. If you start to see roots coming out the bottom, transplant. Now the other thing about starting from seeds is it also lets you, in August, when you're still at full-blown tomato crops and other things, you can take trays and start from seeds what you're going to be planting at the end of September. And so you can start those seeds in August for transplant in September. And so, you're always kind of rotating and moving ahead from seed to starts to planting. And then it's actually wonderful. And the other nice thing about seeds is you can really exercise control over hybrid versus heirloom, the exact variety that you want. And so if you're trying out new types of varieties of different vegetables you like, you can get an incredible level of control, particularly in heirlooms, and try things that you wouldn't normally have tried because they're not available in nurseries here. So I'm a big believer in starting from seeds. Now, any question about seed land?
They're not exactly about seeds, but Emery asks, do you find the water requirements for your veggies and companion plants are the same as your tomatoes? If not, how do you manage different watering requirements on an established irrigation system?
There are two ways to do it. One is to basically find a way to split the system. So my system has 2 zones. And so tomatoes are in one zone or the other. And so I can turn the tomato system down as the summer proceeds and the rest of it's on its own drip line. And the other is, and I have friends that do this, the tomato line gets turned off for some period. They put a shuttlecock in the middle. So they might not water as frequently as the rest, but that's very labor intensive. If you're all on the same line and there's nothing you can do about it, it won't kill the tomatoes. It's just more water than they need to have the same level as the lettuce. Did that answer your question?
Emery, is that
Yes.
all?
Other questions, Kay?
I don't think there are other questions or comments about where people are getting seeds and whatever, but no questions.
Okay. So in April, are we still in April? I've been in this shelter in place so long, I don't know what day of the week it is or what month I'm in anymore. You should troubleshoot your irrigation system. You should build up your soil with compost. You should remove old plant debris. You should check for aphids on tender new plant growth. Get rid of snails and slugs because they're out there. Catch the weeds now before they go to seed. And I've been moving seedlings into the garden. And this is the time to be putting in beets, carrots, lettuce, Swiss chard, potatoes, and in my case, tomatoes. In May, keep an eye on the snails and slugs and aphids. There's the whole next row of things you can be planting and transplants. And then I start my herb garden. Well, to be honest with you, I started the basil seeds already, and they will transplant in a couple weeks. And June is this funny month because some Mays are wet and some Mays are dry, but certainly by June it will be dry. So that's when I start to pay very close attention to my irrigation and watch your container plants to see that your watering is at the right level. It's the earliest you might see powdery mildew. And so you use copper oxide, I think it's called, to spray on the plants to get rid of powdery mildew. You don't need to pull the plant, but you need to not let that get ahead of you. You can still be sowing seeds of basil and beans and beets and carrots and corn, cucumbers, etc. Transplant the last of your starts. Compost tea for your container garden. But really by June, it should be, you're focusing pretty much daily or every week on, have I been tying my tomato plants up? Have I been pinching off the suckers? And as soon as you start to see flowers, turn your irrigation down. There's a bunch of useful things in the handbook. And I just gave you a list of tables that I use, the days to maturity table, how to plant and store, families of common vegetable crops, standard diagnoses and disease resistance. These are useful sections and tables that I've found. Pam Pierce's book is sort of the Bible for local vegetable selection. What's important there is she may have a variety listed in the book that isn't in the nursery. But if you go online, you can order the seeds or starts. I've just found Pam to be remarkably consistent in varieties that work in the climate and microclimates here in the Bay Area. So personally, I'm a big believer. And I think your textbook, you use it now. So that was the vegetable portion. Any questions on that before I move to herbs?
Nothing written down, but people can unmute themselves and ask questions right now if they have them.
Okay.
I had a question.
Sure.
With your
Um,
tea, with the residue, do you then just throw that into the soil, or what are you doing with your residue solid material?
Residue, you mean plant matter?
The compost that you put in the bucket to add the water, then you.
Oh, I just spread it between the plants.
Okay. Okay.
I was wondering what type of seed saving do you like to do?
I'm lazy, I don't. But I belong to Seed Exchange. So the real seed saving, I never use the full packet. So I often share them with friends. So for example, 2 or 3 of my neighbors use different seeds from me from when I buy them. And then I usually plant too many starts. I mean, plant too many seeds that have too many starts. So I give those away to neighbors.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you talk about clay pots?
So the advantage of clay pots are that you have them. And they tend to have holes in the bottom. This is good. And hopefully they're big enough. The disadvantage is that the water evaporates through them faster than plastic, but they're perfectly fine. All of my containers, once a year, I dump all the soil out. I use a water and bleach solution to clean the inside, and then I mix compost with the soil and refill them. But clay pots are fine. I have several.
Thank you.
I had a quick question about broccoli. In my excitement to grow it, I bought some seeds this year, and then I should probably do more reading in Golden Gate Gardening, it sounds like. But the information that I got on them is they need winter cold in order to start. I know you want to type. They need cold in order to start flowering or putting out the florets. And so would I start them and plant them this summer, and then we would get our harvest in the following spring? Sorry, my daughter.
No problem. So if you have a cool climate, you might be able to get away with broccoli planted now. Otherwise, I start the seeds in August and transfer the starts at the end of September. And I don't know if you noticed, I'll show you at the end of the presentation. One year I planted broccoli plants in the pots going up to our front door because it was fenced. And people loved these beautiful plants, and then the broccoli and the cauliflower and grew out of them, and they were gorgeous. So, but it is a cycle-wise. I'm here in Pam's book. You should be in a fall winter planting schedule optimally. But if you're in a cooler part of the county, you might be able to get away with it.
I'm in Eastern Nevada, so that's a negative there. But
yeah,
good information to have. So
yeah, I mean, if you started the seeds in August and you planted them in the garden October 1st, you're good to go.
Okay, great, thank you.
What is the ratio you use for bleach water for your containers?
I think it's about, I'd have to go back and look at the recipe. I think it's like 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 bleach to water. I'd have to go look it up again, but you can find it, I think, on the IPM site.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. So herb gardening, so for the moment, the herbs that you use the most often, and you know who you are, and you probably know what they are, break into two groups, the annuals and the biennials, frankly, and the perennials. But what's most important about herbs is how far from your kitchen are they? And so I try to get the herbs, my herb garden is right outside the kitchen door, right next to the steps. And I know that in a hurry, and it happens all the time, I'm in the middle, or my wife's in the middle of cooking, and goes, you know, and we run out, snip things, and run back in. That's the predominant use case for us. So I've seen people put their herb garden pretty far away from the kitchen, and then you forget about it, or it's more of a schlepp. So the basic thing is planning what herbs you use, and how close to the kitchen can you make them. And because most herbs are shallow rooted, these can be in window boxes. These can be in pots right on the steps next to the kitchen door. You know, it doesn't have to be a great big garden bed. But herbs need sunshine. And so the full sun versus full sun to partial shade, the tendency is to say, put them in the sun and put them as close to the kitchen door as you can. And then but the water usage is different. So there are some that are very low water, like oregano and tarragon. Basil and parsley are actually fairly light consumers. And as you go to the moderate to heavy, your herb garden tends to be on the same drip. So just figure out the median where you want to be in terms of water supply. But here's the tricky thing about herbs. They're also invasive species, which means they grow faster than the things around them and go to seed faster. So if you're planting any of the varieties on the left, you should be planting them in containers because otherwise they're going to take off all over your garden. If you've ever seen a yard full of mint, I can guarantee you they started with a single plant. And then you have the same IPM sites for herbs as you do for everything else in the vegetable garden. Let me just emphasize one thing. The reason to have an herb garden is it's an incredible addition to flavor in food to have picked fresh vegetables and fresh herbs and cooked them in the same hour. You can't compete. The store-bought things are nowhere near as good. So if you know that you live on tomato and basil, onions and eggplant, like we do, and zucchini all summer, the garlic and the basil that we grow makes a material difference into the quality of the food and the enjoyment throughout the whole summer. In the winter, similarly, we grow a lot of parsley and we grow onions and we grow, this year we had cabbage and we had kale and Swiss chard. And that combination of fresh herbs and fresh vegetables from the garden, it's just a much better experience. So you could do more research into the herb area, but fundamentally everybody should have the vegetables that they like and the herbs that they like, and then manage this around making sure that your plant is in the right place, you're adding compost twice a year, and you're mulching as needed. That's sort of the zen of this whole thing. By the way, who asked about the broccoli plant?
That was me.
See the picture in the middle, that pot?
Mm-hmm.
That's a broccoli plant that I had planted October 1st, and that was just before Christmas.
Wow.
And that was the year that I grew broccoli and then the purple cabbage and the cauliflower all going up the steps to the house. And it was just very pretty. And it made for, nothing irritates your relatives more than when you tell them you're going to go outside to pick the vegetables for Christmas or New Year's dinner. The Northeast and the Midwest hate you. It's perfect. So I apologize for ending early, but you are so kind to have listened to all this. I'm impressed with you all as a class because this is inherently much harder than when I went through this.
Well, Joe, there are a couple questions that just popped up.
Okay.
And two of them are kind of practical, and one is just more into what we're thinking these days. But one is, can you talk about growing garlic in a nutshell?
Well, no, you need more room than a nutshell. It's too small. I'm growing onions and garlic that I planted in October, and they have a longer growing cycle. So I have a whole bed devoted to those. And then it's that elephant garlic, you know, the big ones. And so I'm optimistic I'll have a good crop this year. But we use a lot of garlic, so we decided to start growing it.
Anything tricky about it?
No, it's brain dead. You make the soil needs to be rich. You know, add a lot of compost. You buy the starts for the garlic and the onions, and you put the little bulb in. What you would normally chop up and eat. You plant those, and then you ignore it, and it seems to be doing fine.
Okay,
if I'm remembering correctly, plant them around your tomatoes, right? Since the alliums are good companions for tomatoes.
Well, except these have a longer growth cycle, so I actually started them in October. I'm going to be harvesting. I think the onions are June, July, and I think the garlic is July, August.
Well, somebody is also asking about, can we grow artichokes in Larkspur?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. But I mean, it's sort of an aphid hotel, but it's absolutely, you can grow artichokes all over Marin. Piece of cake.
All right. Somebody says, Julie asks, we have creeping rosemary in our garden. Is that edible?
I don't know. Susan?
I have no idea.
My understanding is that you can eat it. It's just not going to be as flavorful as the cultivar selected for kitchen use.
Right. But you could look it up in Pam Pierce is the other answer.
And
Great.
Glenn,
Everybody.
hey, Julie. And then Glenda asks, how has the current situation impacted how you think about your garden? You, Joe.
Well, I've had more anxiety attacks that seem to manifest themselves in frantic behavior that is best used for weeding. So I'm way ahead on my weeding. It's a really good question. Mental health is dodgy right now. And I find, like Susan said, being in the garden, I put a chair out there so I can sit, and I like watching stuff grow. And I think it's a way of finding peace in a very tumultuous period. I have faith that they'll steer through the storm and be fine. I just don't like being in storms, if you know what I mean. So I think vegetable gardening is, it's a really good thing to do in this environment. And if you screw up and the plant dies, it's not a felony. So what the hell?
Well, and also just coming to these master gardener classes, it takes your mind off of what's going on out there. So.
Yeah. For example, I only made one reference to he who will not be named. That's not bad. Any other questions or comments? So the classic question in mid-April is, am I too late to start fill in the blank? I would say get out your Pam Pierce book, look to see And even if you're putting seeds in now for things that go in the ground February, March, April, you should be able to make it work. And view your vegetable garden as a year-round practice in being connected. And so, you know, if you miss something like the broccoli question, if you missed this cycle, plant the seeds in cups in August, transplant them in end of September, and catch the next cycle. So there's no harm, no foul. You can adjust, but stay connected and stay peaceful about it. And also stay vigilant. Watch for critters and problems, and don't let them get away from you. Other questions?
Anything else? Oh, so Arlene is asking, what is square foot gardening? I guess you and Jeff could answer that for us, Joe.
So it's a guy did a bunch of research, I think 20 years ago now, engineer, trying to figure out how to increase crop yields. So he published a book that was very popular. There are also other sources of the same information, but it's how to optimize your soil mix and optimize how you plant and what you plant to increase the yield per square foot. And so it's very intense vegetable gardening. It's very interesting, but it requires more attention to soil additives and more attention to plant selection and exactly how you're planting. Jeff, was it you who do square foot?
Yeah, I do square foot gardening in my beds at home. The advantage I find is that it drastically increases planting density when compared to growing in rows.
Right.
So instead of having one long row of something, you have like literally a little square foot where the plants are just far enough apart from each other that they get what they need without overcrowding. So things like radishes and carrots, you can plant very densely, versus tomatoes, you'd only plant like one in a square foot and probably leave it separated from the other tomatoes by a couple feet, like Joe was saying. There are a lot of great resources online about calculating planting density, but essentially when you look at a seed packet, it says plant spacing and then row spacing. You throw out the row spacing number and just focus on the plant spacing. I actually made a little square foot planting guide where you can like put it down on your garden bed and then poke holes in the soil where you want your 16 plants per square foot, and then plop a seed into each one of those holes. Super easy, fun 1 hour DIY project at home to do.
And if you have a very small yard or a very small area that gets a lot of sun, square foot gardening is a way to optimize for that. So it really, and if you're doing sort of those rectangular raised beds, container a foot wide, 6 or 8 feet long, square foot gardening is a great way to maximize what your yield is. So it's a great strategy for constrained space.
Sounds great. Anything else, anybody?
I'll just make a comment in case anybody was interested in saving seeds. There's a great resource. It's my Bible. It's called The Seed Garden. The art and science, or the art and practice of seed saving, and it's put out by the Seed Savers Exchange. It is a wonderful resource if you're into trying to save some of those heirloom seeds year over year. It's got a lot of really great practical stuff.
My brother saves seeds and criticizes me every year because I have not converted to seed saving. I pointed out that he voted, unfortunately, in 2016, so we're even. Any other questions?
I was wondering, I'm new to sort of doing vegetable gardening here in Marin, and I was wondering if there's a place of information where you could say, plant this many tomato plants, if you're a family of 2 or if you're a family of 4, and this should satisfy most of your needs. I realize it'll vary from family to family, but are there any guidelines where you could start?
No. So the first year I tried this, what is your name?
Shauna.
Shauna. So my first year with tomato growing, I had 2 smaller containers, but I had 4 or 6 plants. And that was what got me going to Master Gardeners, because I realized I picked the wrong containers and I didn't know what I was doing. And there's just 2 of us, but we eat tomatoes all summer. So 4 to 6 plants is like our minimum. The year I had 24 plants, apparently that was considered excessive, but I had a lot of neighbors and friends that year. So somewhere between 4 and 24 is probably the right place for you. And I just experiment. Any other questions? All right, so for when, if you're at all like me and you're just trying to pass the test eventually, not that the rest of you would be like this. Everything on the test is in the book. Most of what I'm talking about is in the book. The flavor section is not. That's just something I worry about personally. And if you are interested in learning more about flavor and vegetable gardening, there's more on tomatoes. There's precious little in the rest of the vegetable families. So if you're optimizing for flavor, as long as you have nutrient-rich soil, heirlooms seem to have more flavor. But, you know, you'd have to kind of try it by type. So, Kay, is there anything else? Is there a test after this? No.
Yeah, it's a surprise test. No, just kidding. No, Joe, that was fabulous. Thank you so much.
I hope you all have a wonderful summer. Stay safe. Do not socialize in person. And may you have wonderful tomatoes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe, for your time.